Have you ever heard of a morale patch? Well, chances are you have and didn't know it. Here's the story. While the term morale patch didn't come into existence for some time, they have their start with the military, and the earliest examples were also called blood chits. Now, a blood chit is a notice carried by military personnel and addressed to civilians who may have come across a soldier, sailor, or airman in need of assistance. One of the first blood chits was reportedly issued in 1793 by George Washington to a French balloonist demonstrating his hot air balloon in the United States. Because the pilot did not speak English and could not control the direction of the wind, and thus he had little or no control over where the balloon would travel or where he would land, Washington gave him a letter that said that all U.S. citizens should assist him in returning to Philadelphia. The next step in the evolution of the morale patch was in the late 1800s when the British military introduced battle patches that were made of gold thread and were worn on the left sleeve of high-ranking officers. The United States military started using unit patches during the Civil War, and while they were used by both Union and Confederate armies, did not become standard until the Great War, when the U.S. Army's 81st Division created the first ever unit patch, which had an embroidered wildcat on an olive green background. The leaders of the division not only wanted the patch to help identify the units of a soldier, but they also wanted to boost the morale of the troops. Soon after its introduction, General Blackjack Pershing ordered every American division to develop and wear a unique patch for their unit. During World War II, the number and the design of these patches increased due to a greater need and improvements in the materials used to create the patches. Even Walt Disney Company was brought in during the war to create and manufacture morale patches featuring Disney characters. During the Vietnam War, these colorful and sometimes whimsical patches were replaced when it became a widespread practice for individual soldiers to make sarcastic, rude, or critical statements on a patch somewhere on their uniform. These unofficial patches became known as morale patches, and the term was born. This week, we're talking to Tim Brown about how members of the Order of the Arrow were identified, and we'll learn more about the development and evolution of the Ladge Flap in this edition of Artifact of the Week. Today we want to talk about the insignia that identifies a scout or scouter as a member of the Order of the Arrow. How did we know that people were a member of the OA back in the very beginning?
Well, insignia started on uniforms for the Order of the Arrow almost as soon as it was developed in the teens. But they had what they called totem pins. They were little animals or features of their designation attached to a chain. And they wore those typically on their sashes or they wore them on their civilian clothes more so than on their uniform.
And so what did that evolve into, and how did the idea of a Ladge Flap come about?
Well, pins typically were made out of silver or gold, and even at $5 or $10 back in the teens, that's a lot of money. So cloth patches and felt patches and things like that started being developed, and some of them were silk screened, some were embroidered, that kind of thing. So that kind of was the evolution that kind of moved away. But they did have pins. Pins basically continued all the way up to the 60s in a lot of cases.
So what would be recognized as one of the first Ladge Flaps?
Well, one of the first Ladge Flaps was, the first Ladge Flap was Ojibwe Lodge 33, and they created a patch in different colors, light green, dark green, depending on the shade of the uniform, but they were square patches, and they basically folded them under in the shape of a flap and put it on the pocket here. And the first one was created around 1942, and they were the first lodge known to have produced a flap per se.
What would be the next step in the evolution of the Ladge Flap?
The Uniform and Insignia Department of the Boy Scouts did not designate an area on the uniform for those types of patches, at least not in the beginning. They did come up with the Universal Arrow Ribbon. It's a little ribbon, red and white, that has the arrow on it that you wore on your button. And that was the first, that was in 1942. So that was the first designated OA piece that the Insignia Department allowed us to put on there.
Has the Universal Arrow Ribbon changed over time?
It has. And initially when they were produced, the arrow pointed the wrong way. It actually pointed towards the wearer's left shoulder. And when they reordered those, they pointed towards the right. It wasn't for any reason other than it was ordered incorrectly.
As we move forward, we got into lodge numbers and more complex designs. How did that all happen?
Yeah, I think different fabrics, different, people could actually put more detail in patches from embroidery and manufacturing companies. But there was a huge growth of lodges from 1915 to roughly 1948 when we were incorporated in the Boy Scouts of America as an official program. There was about 400 lodges that were developed. So everybody had a different totem, different name, and that kind of thing, different numbers. So a lot of things were created. Some of the early flaps were twill that were embroidered on, some were completely embroidered, but traditionally what you see today are very colorful flaps, multi-part flaps, two-part flaps where you have the flat part here and then a large piece down below. So it's come a long way for sure.
So what is what are some of the cooler or neat examples of lodge flaps that we have either on display here or that you know about?
Well, there's two here in this case that are really pretty fancy. The Malibu flap 566, Lodge 566 in California, they had what they call the shark flap. And I don't know how many colors, maybe 16, 17 colors. It was one of the more colorful flaps. It came out around 72 or 73, and I think Dr. Jeff Morley was the one who designed that. But also in this case is a beluga flap. And 538 is a very, very rare patch. That lodge was headquartered in the Philippines at Clark Air Force Base. It was only a lodge for a few years in the late 50s. So their patch is very, very valuable. We have one here, and they had a nice neckerchief, which we have here on display as well.
Are there any other historical lodge flaps that you can think of that kind of stand out as having some significance behind them besides the first or the ones you've mentioned?
Well, there are a few. I think everybody talks about the Yanami Lodge flap, the very first lodge. It wasn't a very old flap. It's not a very rare flap, but it's a unique flap, and almost all collectors would like to have a Yanami F1, lodge flap in their collection.
Today, lodges use lodge flaps to raise money for NOAC, for jamboree contingents, and a lot of other purposes in their council. How has that changed the concept of the lodge flap?
Oh, well, it's just exploded in the number of varieties. When I first joined my lodge, we maybe had from the beginning in 1952 till I got in 74, a total of 6 or 7 different flaps. My same lodge over the next 50 years, we're probably up to 200 to 225. So there's a flap for everything. And it's really a moneymaker for lodges because they sell them as moneymakers for every event, whether it's a spring fellowship, fall fellowship, a trip to NOAC, a jamboree contingent. They make a special flap just about for everything.
In the 1920s, with patches becoming unique and individualized, they became very popular as something to collect and trade, and the patch collection hobby was born. This newfound hobby allowed people across an organization such as the military or the Boy Scouts to connect in their shared but unique experiences. It also allowed those outside these organizations a way to connect and learn more about something they were not directly involved in. Today, patch trading is a big part of most scouting events like NOAC or a jamboree, and even here at Philmont, the Philmont Training Center has informal patch trading sessions every week. Also, here at the National Scouting Museum, patches play a big role in connecting visitors to the stories we are telling in the exhibits and displays. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Join us next time as we continue to learn more about the history of the BSA through the collection of the National Scouting Museum and Artifact of the Week.